is broken down into two different major sections, and this is the second major section that we are in, most notable because it focuses primarily now on what Ezra actually does in Jerusalem, which prior to this, all the things that we looked at are primarily talking about what came before Ezra, basically how we get to the point where the people return and then getting towards the situation where we're at as Ezra arrives. So today we're going to call this Ezra's authority. Well, we might. Let's see, we've got this clicker. Give me a second. Tell you what, I won't have Dad. Okay. That'll hook that up for us. But again, looking at Ezra chapter 7, this is going to be a section in which Ezra's role in this book is going to be more clearly defined. And a lot of that's going to have to do from the perspective of what the king will order. And this is going to be one of the things that we talk about in this, hopefully we'll be able to talk about today, is the idea that authority is important. And Ezra is not just going to be a man of authority from the perspective of, he's the one establishing authority, but the king is also just as instrumental in this as well. And so Ezra is going to have a very big role moving forward in the history of Jerusalem. And as evident, we'll see that as well when we get to Nehemiah, who also makes references to Ezra as well. So this is Ezra's authority. Again, we're looking at Ezra 7, and you're going to try to get down through verse 28. We may not be able to do that, though. All right. So what are the key points to think about this morning? One's mission is often easier with greater authority from above. And we're going to see that this plays out with Ezra. Ezra is going to be given a lot of support, and a lot of that's going to come from the fact that he has an extra authority above. Certainly we'll think about this for us as Christians as well. We have an authority above us as well that should help make our mission easier. Our example may not lead to the conversion of others, but it still can have a benefit for the work of God. We're going to notice that with the relationship that kind of is identified between Ezra and Artaxerxes, and that's going to be our second key point to keep in mind. And then the third is that it's our responsibility to take advantage of the opportunities that God provides. And this is going to be essentially how the end of the chapter is summed up by what Ezra's response is to this letter that has been sent. So we're going to break this down into three major sections. We'll begin, first of all, with Ezra's task. This comes from verses 11 through 20. So let's read now down through verse 12. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave Ezra the priest, the scribe, expert in the words of the commandments of the Lord and of his statutes to Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, a scribe of the law of the God of heaven, perfect peace, and so forth. All right, so we notice that this is a letter. We know that Ezra is essentially going to leave to go to Jerusalem in verses 1 through 10, but he also takes with him a letter that basically explains what his role is and is going to explain basically the king's support for what Ezra is trying to do. And obviously we'll see how that's important in a minute, right? So first thing we got to keep in mind is that Ezra's task that is alluded to in verses 9 and 10, that comes out in this letter, all of this is being amplified by the king's authority. In other words, we know the type of man that Ezra is, but Ezra also has additional authority for what he's doing. Certainly God has had a hand in that, but he's also got political help. And that's going to be simply from the fact that Artaxerxes is supporting Ezra's responsibility in this. This also would have given to Ezra a greater degree of security. Certainly when you think about what his job is, as evident by the fact that he's going to have to lead others in this process. But this is going to be a job in which he's going to be given greater authority. Much in the same way that Darius, as we saw back in chapter 6, had supported the people in the reconstruction of the temple, that gave to them a greater security as it pertained to those who opposed the rebuilding of the temple. Well, now Ezra is going to have a greater degree of security to carry out this task because alongside Ezra, he's got a copy of the letter of the king of Artaxerxes to take to explain what his role is. So we also notice that this would help solidify the king's control over the area. We'll see how that plays out kind of in verses 25 and 26. But keep in mind, we've talked about that at times Persian kings had to deal with threats on their western border. And so anytime you have the opportunity to kind of make things stable, that certainly would be good for the perspective of the Persian military and for the king. And that's exactly what Ezra is going to help do in this process, because he's going to provide stability by telling people to obey the law of God, and thereby you're going to have a people that are not going to be rebellious toward the Persian Empire. And that certainly plays a huge benefit for Artaxerxes as well, which is why this letter is also important for him just as much as it's important for Ezra. And Persian kings often required foreign nations to comply with local laws. That was actually a very common way that they maintained order in their empire, was simply they told the people in the areas that they conquered that whatever the local laws of the land are, you need to submit to them, and thereby you will submit to the Persian government. We actually have a very good example of this that comes in the archaeology and the artifacts that are recovered come from the time supposedly of Darius I, who was the king that we looked at in chapter 6. But there were a group of Jewish refugees, perhaps around the time of the Babylonian captivity, that were not taken into captivity, that actually fled to a small island south in the southern part of Egypt called the Elephantine Island. And this is actually one of the, when we get to the New Testament, we know that the Jews are kind of spread out at that point throughout the known world. This is actually one of the very first civilizations outside of Jerusalem where you actually have artifacts from the Jewish settlers. And these supposedly come from the time of Darius I. Again, a group of refugees that had apparently left probably during the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. They settle on this island, and there's correspondence between these group of Jewish refugees and Darius I. And this is a picture of kind of the ruins of the settlement on the island. But there was a letter written by King Darius that told the Jewish settlers in that area that they needed to comply with the laws related to the Feast of Unleavened Bread and a couple of other and a couple of other regulations according to Jewish law. And so the point is that these are a group of refugees that don't live in Jerusalem, but under Darius I, the archaeology reveals that he had basically told them in a letter that they needed to comply closely with the same type of reforms that Ezra is trying to implement. And that just, again, gives you the idea that this is the policy of the Persian Empire. Again, perhaps reveals just how close the Jewish religion had become to the kings of Persia, simply because there's evidence that he would send this letter out to a group of Jews who didn't live in Jerusalem. But again, that's the point, is the idea that you comply with the local laws. That makes you better and more loyal to the laws of a national level. In the United States, we have something similar to this. This is why we have what's called a federal government, the way that our governmental system is set up, right? We have a federal government that makes laws. We have a state government that makes laws. We have a local government that makes laws. And again, the idea is that you follow the local and state laws. You're more likely to also follow federal laws as well. Kind of a similar idea, but that's just something that I came across that I found interesting. It's obviously not in the Bible, but there are other types of archaeological artifacts that do support, some of the same themes that are being carried out here. And certainly the perspective of the Persian king on maintaining order is carried out in this example as it is with what Ezra is doing. All right, so Ezra's task then, in verses 13 through, now down 13 through 17, Artaxerxes follows up in that letter and says, I issue a decree that all those of the people of Israel and priests and Levites in my realm who volunteer to go up to Jerusalem may go with you. And whereas you are being sent by the king and his 7 counselors to inquire concerning Judah and Jerusalem with regard to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and whereas you are to carry the silver and gold which the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem, and whereas all the silver and gold that you may find in all the province of Babylon, along with the freewill offering of the people and the priest, are to be freely offered for the house of their God in Jerusalem. Now therefore be careful to buy with this money bulls, rams, and lambs, with their grain offerings and their drink offerings, and offer them on the altar of the house of your God in Israel. All right, so there's a lot that's said here, but as we break this down, we notice that Ezra's task is going to fit into the 2 categories of leading others and inquiring about the situation that is in Jerusalem. Again, we see that from the people that are expected or that have the opportunity to go from where they're at, where they've been in captivity. The people, the priests and the Levites, whoever wants to go, has the ability now to go with Ezra on this mission. So notice that there were other Jews who were inspired to return home. And when you think about those key points that we talked about, this is important. And this is why the king's authority is also important in this, is that the example that was set by generations and decades of Jews, or decades ago from the Jews that had got out of captivity and left, those individuals now have left an example for them to follow after. And so we see a lot of people take advantage of this opportunity, and they now are going to go with Ezra on this mission and to help him carry out the responsibilities of it. Notice that he has a responsibility to take the law to the people. That's one of the other interesting things that's indicated to us here. Again, notice verse 14, that Ezra had the responsibility with regard to the law of your God, which is in your hand. What would that imply to us about the people that are already there in Jerusalem? Well, I think it would imply that they have not had the law at this point. At least they didn't have a written copy of the law. is what that is implying, because that's going to be one of his jobs. We talked about that he's a scribe, he's a priest. He's going to have a responsibility to teach the law. And it could have been the case, and apparently it was, based on the implication here, that the people may not have had an actual written copy of the law with them. So what they were doing was simply what they had been told to do. But now Ezra, and we know later on that there are going to be some issues with the people, later on when Ezra gets there, but very well could have been the case that they didn't necessarily have a copy of the law with them. And so that also is going to amplify why Ezra's mission is important, because he's got to take the law to the people, right, to make sure that they know exactly what they are following. And again, all of this is being done, and all this travel is being done in conditions that we would not think about being great for travel. And again, this is why the king's authority is important. Again, it's going to provide a greater measure of security for Ezra and these men to move forward in this. And so Artaxerxes and Ezra must have been very close to one another. And this goes back to the example of, you don't really realize the significance of your example until you may not realize that your example has much of a significance, even if it doesn't lead to the conversion of somebody else. I mean, just notice the references that are made. In this part of the letter that we've looked at, just notice the references that are made. Right? These are the words of Artaxerxes. You notice here that he doesn't give just a simple call to the Jewish people to leave, right? You notice verse 13, it says, the people of Israel, the priest and the Levites in my realm, which gives us an understanding that Artaxerxes apparently had some understanding of the law of God, or at least had an understanding of the Jewish religious system, because of his ability to distinguish these different categories of Jewish travelers. Again, you notice too that he has respect, or he acknowledges the fact that Ezra has a copy of the law of God, right, which would indicate to us the prior books of the Old Testament. And again, those references are all relevant to the fact, and this whole mission is relevant to the fact that, Ezra must have had a pretty big impact on Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes being the king, Ezra must have had a really big impact on him. If somebody would, read for us Esther 1 and verse 14.
Esther 1:14. And the next unto him was Carthena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Arsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and who sat the first in the kingdom.
So that obviously comes from a different point in Persia's history, but the point from that verse was that, from what it indicates to us, is that there were 7 very close advisors to the king of Persia. And it could have very well been the case that Ezra was, to some degree, within that group, just simply because of the ties that Artaxerxes and Ezra have. There's no record that Artaxerxes ever, proselytized and became a follower of the law of God, right, of the Old Testament law. But again, Ezra's example has made an impact on Artaxerxes' life, and has obviously made an impact and has benefited the people of God, again, from having this opportunity to now go back and take with them all of these possessions. Again, you notice that a lot of these things are similar to what had happened under Cyrus. The free will offerings, the gold and the silver, the animals that are going to be provided. Again, it also shows that Artaxerxes has respect for all the things that the Jewish people needed to carry out their proper sacrifices. Much like Darius, Artaxerxes probably understood, and I think is implied a little bit later in this letter, very well understood that what the people of God did in Jerusalem would go directly to help maintaining his own kingdom. And so there's a huge example that Ezra has left on Artaxerxes' life by what he has done, what he's trying to do for the people of God. So provide for the people, right? Notice again the wealth of the king and the people. This is not just coming directly from the treasure of the king, but also his counselors. And as it says in verse 16, the free will offering of the people. Again, similarities to what we saw in chapter 1 with Ezra. Those are just two depictions of a group of artifacts that come from a select group of treasures that were discovered that trace back to the Persian Empire at this time. The bottom left is figurines of either individuals or gods. The top right picture is just supposedly an amulet, so what you would wear on your arm as a piece of jewelry. Just gives you an idea of the type of treasure that might have been involved. But the point is that all these things are going to help provide for the temple and the work within it. Notice that there are also additional vessels that are mentioned here. And this is kind of implied in verse 15. Keep in mind that a lot of the vessels that had been taken out of the temple at this point have been restored. And so Artaxerxes kind of follows that up with providing even more vessels and wealth for the temple. And this is certainly to all the people's benefit. And so in all of this, you have to keep in mind that Ezra was a very trustworthy person. Artaxerxes did not leave this mission in the hands of just some individual, right? As he says by his own testament in verse 12 and verse 13, he had a lot of faith in Ezra, right? And obviously, I think it speaks to their relationship. But, Ezra's a very trustworthy person. That's why he's been given this opportunity to carry out this work for the people of God. And, by implication, when you think about this as a point of application that, for us as Christians, we've been given a lot of responsibility, and so that should motivate us to be faithful. That should motivate us to be trustworthy, simply because the task that we have to teach others, to lead others to Christ, that is a task of utmost importance. And so there's a need to show ourselves trustworthy and to be someone that can be trusted to those that are around us. And Artaxerxes knows that Ezra can be trusted. That's why he's been put in this position to lead God's people by the example that he set. All right, and so again, notice verse 18 through 20. Whatever seems good to you and your brethren to do with the rest of the silver and gold, do it according to the will of your God. Also, the articles that are given to you for the service of the house of your God, deliver in full before the God of Jerusalem, and whatever more may be needed for the house of your God, which you may have occasion to provide, pay for it in the king's treasury. And so Artaxerxes, again, issues all of these things to help Ezra in his mission. And so verses 21 through 26, he then turns and gives basically a decree to the other people that could be involved in this, right? Give them what they need. And the clicker's not working now. Hold on, let me try turning it off and turn it back on. There we go. All right, so give them what they need. First of all, to avoid the wrath of heaven. Notice verse 21, and I, even I, Artaxerxes the king, issue a decree to all the treasurers who are in the region beyond the river, that whatever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of God of heaven, may require of you, let it be done diligently. Up to 100 talents of silver, 100 cores of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of oil, and salt without prescribed limit. Whatever is commanded by the God of heaven, let it be done diligently for the house of the God of heaven. For why should there be wrath against the realm of the king and his sons? You know, that's one of the things that Ezra is going to reiterate to the people eventually when he gets to Jerusalem, is their need to repent with a particular issue so that they don't bring on the wrath of God as their ancestors had done. Again, Artaxerxes understood who Ezra was and understood this point where he knew that the God of heaven, the God of Ezra, would, in his wrath, destroy nations if he saw to it. And so, certainly the example of Ezra rubs off here because of the fact that Artaxerxes wants the support of the God of heaven, the God of Ezra. And that's why all of these things need to be done. The provisions that are made in verses 21 and 22. About 100 talents of silver supposedly would be about a little under 4 tons of silver. And all of these items are very extravagant. Again, a lot of this is going to be due to helping provide for the people as they travel, but also to help provide sacrifices. And again, you notice that salt is prescribed without its limit. We've already talked about salt was very important. It was a sign of ratifying a covenant under the Old Testament law. Salt was used to help make a covenant permanent. And in essence, it symbolizes kind of this covenant that Artaxerxes and Ezra, that Artaxerxes is making through Ezra to help strengthen his own kingdom by giving the God of heaven the opportunity to have his people restore proper worship there and to help rebuild the city. So to avoid the wrath of God, I think Brother Wayne talked about this a few weeks ago. That's one of the things that motivates us as Christians, right? Certainly the love of God, but certainly also because we know about the wrath of God and we don't want to fall on the wrong side of his wrath. Artaxerxes understood that. That's why he's giving this task to Ezra. Notice that they're not also going to put taxes on these religious authorities. Again, verse 24, we inform you that it shall not be lawful to impose tax, tribute, or custom on any of the priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, Nethinim, or servants of this house of God. We've mentioned before, this was a policy of the Persian government. This also kind of fit within their idea of restoring worship in these local areas to give those people what they need, but also, don't tax them, right? Don't make their life overburdened with it. And Ezra, of course, is given a position of authority to make sure that policy stays in place, because you also notice verse 25 and 26 that Ezra's responsibility is to teach and keep the law. And you, Ezra, according to your God-given wisdom, set magistrates and judges who may judge all the people who are in the region beyond the river, all such as know the laws of your God, and teach those who do not know them. Whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily on him, whether it be death or banishment or confiscation of goods or imprisonment. And so Ezra also carries judicial power, right? If he's the one that carries the law, if he's the teacher of the law, then he's also going to have responsibility to administer punishment for when the law was broken. And again, that keeps in mind, and that's reflective of the Old Testament law, where again, a lot of times the teachers of the law, the people in positions of authority who knew the law, were expected to carry out the punishment for not following the law. That's why the stories of Nadab and Abihu are really prominent in the Old Testament, where you got people in religious and civil power under that law that that flagrantly contradict what God said. And that's why, in part why God destroys them in Leviticus 10, because the religious authorities were not only expected to teach the law, but also they were, in a lot of cases, seen as administering judicial punishment for not keeping it. And so Ezra carries with him the judicial weight of enforcing the law as well. And so Ezra's responsibility is also prominent in that way. He's also, in essence, going to be the disciplinarian, which is a big part of how this book will end, and how that can be important in the lives of the followers of God. Again, notice that there are varying degrees to this punishment. Certainly, Ezra is given the responsibility for figuring out how to administer it. And as we know, Ezra is going to look back to the Old Testament law, which stated that there were different punishments depending on various crimes. But Ezra is given that authority by the king to do that. This is a picture, by the way, of Artaxerxes I. That's his tomb, supposedly. Supposedly that is, but anyway, I found a picture of that, thought it would be interesting. But that's his point to Ezra is, we're going to give you what you need to help stabilize the area. And this is what Ezra is going to do, because we're going to see there's a big problem that's on the horizon that he's going to have to deal with. So Ezra's initiative then is the fact that God has watched over him and that he is going to respond to God's faithfulness. Notice verse 27 and 28 to round out the chapter. Blessed be the Lord God of our fathers, who has put such a thing as this in the king's heart, to beautify the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem, and has extended mercy to me before the king and his counselors, and before all the king's mighty princes. So I was encouraged as the hand of the Lord my God was upon me, and I gathered leading men of Israel to go up with me. Notice that it clearly states here in verses 27 and 28, we move from Artaxerxes' perspective in the letter. And in verses 27 and 28, notice that it's now Ezra talking, who, having read this letter, having, in the process of about to leave and having in his possession this letter, is greatly encouraged that God has given him this opportunity. Again, this is not a coincidence to Ezra. This is not just some random thing that has happened that has just fallen into his lap. Ezra, of course, sees this as the fulfillment of the providence of God. You don't necessarily know how old Ezra is. You don't know how long Ezra had been working with the king. But now has come a point where God has rewarded Ezra for his faithfulness and has rewarded him by giving him responsibility to carry out this task. And so, because the greater authority has been behind Ezra at this point, and because God has shown that he is going to be faithful to those who are loyal to him, Ezra now has much more of an incentive, or much more of an initiative to now carry out this mission, because there's a lot riding on it. God is also now depending on him, and that's very clear based on the content of this letter. And so that's what we're going to see in chapter 8, is a list of those who are going to return. And in chapters 9 and 10, Ezra deals with essentially the major problem that is going to need to be corrected. But all of this begins because Ezra was a man of faith, he was a man of responsibility, and he was a trustworthy individual, and God gave to him more responsibility. As Christians, again, we understand that, as we grow, we prove ourselves to be trustworthy. The reward that God gives us a lot of times is a greater responsibility to carry out his work. And that's not something, and that responsibility is not something that we need to, kind of shy away from. That's a part of our responsibility when it comes to growing as Christians, is to take advantage of the opportunities that God provides, as exactly what Ezra has done. With that being said, are there any final comments on what we've said today?
you think about Artaxerxes, the king, and how he respected the God of Ezra, and as we studied in chapter 7, he's giving in and making supplies, and you contrast that with Pharaoh, centuries earlier, he had no respect for Moses or for Moses' God, and just a light day, difference, or light day difference between the two, and of course you see the end result of what happened to Pharaoh because of no respect.
Right.
We get great respect here on the part of Artaxerxes for Ezra's God.
Absolutely. We'll stop here. We'll pick up in chapter 8 hopefully next week. But thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.